What did you write about story structure recently, Audrey?
I wrote a post where I basically said I thought the whole idea comes from people studying existing writings, like usually classics, Shakespeare and um, Dickens and other, people who wrote a long time ago and who've been analyzed to bits by academics. And I think that's where that whole idea of there being a structure like that that's common to well done stories has come from. And I'm not sure that it really helps someone who's writing something, although, like while you're writing it, like maybe when you finished, you can kind of check against the 3-act or any structure, and that might help you to polish your work up. But I don't know. It seems to me it might impose a kind of artificiality. I mean, if you're writing something that isn't a drama as such, and you apply a structure to it that's supposed to be dramatic, it might just distort your whole story. So that's basically my feeling about it.
When you write, are you thinking about the structure of the story?
Not in an abstract way. I'm thinking of it more from the inside, like, here we are, this has happened, and now logically this is going to happen. And I'm usually aiming towards some sort of conclusion.
Right.
And I want to get certain scenes in. Really, it's all a bunch of stringing scenes together to make an arc that's satisfying for whatever type of story it is. And that might actually follow some of the structures. And I mean, recently there were some posts on the Story Reading Apes blog. I think he provided links to these things. And somebody mentioned Kurt Vonnegut, who defined a whole bunch of different story types, like man in whole, and things start out bad and get worse, or things start out good and get bad. I mean, I'm misrepresenting those, but it seems that this has been studied and labeled, and there's all kinds of things. But again, I'm not sure that it really helps at the moment of creation. Maybe when you're editing. That's basically what I have to say about story structure.
Yeah. Never underestimate humankind's need to label and categorize and put things in different buckets. And if it doesn't go in a bucket, or you can't come up with a label, then it obviously doesn't fit, right?
Yeah, especially if you're writing a thesis or an article for an academic journal.
So we can blame it all on the academicians, right?
Well, some of it.
Absolutely. Why not?
What about you, Berthold?
I think what Audrey says is largely right, that it's something people figure out when they're reverse engineering completed works. And I can believe that a lot of works probably do follow loosely a 3-act structure, but I don't know. I was thinking about it, like, I've never consciously said, okay, now this is the end of Act 1, and now here is where we begin Act 2. I could probably retroactively go back and look at my stories and say, well, yeah, I guess this is Act 1, this is Act 2, but that's like, I don't know, is that just tailoring it retroactively to fit the model that I want? I mean, I don't know. Is it? I don't know how to say it. And I was thinking too, like the long short stories, which is a term I got from you, Mark. I've written like 3 of those because I really like it. I don't know if those fit a 3-act structure or not. Maybe they do, but I'm not sure. They may.
Well, if every single story has to follow the 3-act structure, that's a lot of acts in a 2,000-word story or whatever. It just seems like some of this, depends on, again, what type of story you're writing, what the length of the story is, all sorts of other things. But for anybody out there listening, the 3-act structure was something that, I mean, I know I've heard it before, but someone actually tweeted a graph of it within the last couple of weeks. And it's basically the idea that every story should have 3 acts, and there are, inciting incidents and second thoughts and obstacles and more obstacles and disaster and crises. And then you have descending action in Act 3, which is the resolution of the story. And It's funny because the novel that I just completed is accidentally a 3-act story because it ended up being 3 parts, but it wasn't, there was no intention. But when I wrote the first part, that was 1 year in these people's lives. And then I decided to write more, and it became a 3-part. Each part is the next year in their lives as things continue to build up. But
Yeah,
it was
well,
unintentional. I can't even, to me, it's like writing that way would be like, I don't even, how do you put it together a fence? What's the logical progression of putting together building a fence or something like that? Well, first you have to dig the post holes, then you have to, it's like, and I don't know, that seems to me to take something out of it for me if I had to think about that while I'm writing.
well, that's just it. I think maybe a lot of stories do eventually follow something like that pattern, but I really don't think the authors in most cases sat down consciously to say, okay, well, here I'm like 10,000 words into a, I don't know, 80,000 word novel, so I should be here. This should be.
It's time for a crisis.
Yeah, like I don't think that would work really. So yeah, I think it comes from analysis of completed works and then people who write advice for writers have looked at that and said, see, this is a pattern you should follow. But I like any of these rules and things we've talked about, there may be some merit to it, but I think that writers shouldn't allow themselves to be kind of dictated to like that, because it could distort a perfectly good story. I mean, you could write something and think it's great, and maybe you had some feedback on that's positive, and then you think, oh man, it doesn't follow the 3-act structure. There must be something wrong. And then you start fiddling with it and mess it up. So
yeah.
I was going to say, I think I've read some books where you'll get to a part where it feels like the author went and said, oh, I better have a crisis. Like you said, that better happen here. And you're like, where did that come from? It's just out of the blue. And that actually damages the story.
yeah, if it's artificial. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at about just over the halfway point on the first draft of this thing I'm doing on page 121. I can see it from here. And every now and then I sit down to write and I think, I haven't actually looked at the beginning again. And I know that I've thought a lot about it, and I've kind of made mental notes saying, here, we should change this. And I hope I remember this when I get to the second draft. But sometimes I think, nothing's happening. I really need to do some kind of action here. So let's see what can happen. So I think it's pretty lumpy right now. But am I following any sort of prescribed structure? Not really. I just figure I'm here and I have to get to point Z over here, and I have notes for a bunch of things that have to happen. And I kind of hope that in the end it'll be interesting for someone to read, but whether it'll follow any sort of prescribed structure is, I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Well, it's also, the other thing that I always feel like I notice is people who have MFAs seem to write stories in a certain way. And it's, I don't know, it's why? Is that you went to get a master's in fine arts so that you could write to a formula? I don't know.
Yeah, there's probably a formula for free form writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So about a week ago, someone on Twitter mentioned 2 books about writing that she really liked, and I went out and ordered them. This is kind of like homework that I assigned to myself for today. One of them is called The Storytelling Animal. That's probably backwards.
No, it isn't.
It's backwards or forwards for you, but it's by a guy by the name of Jonathan Gottschall. He's a English professor at Washington and Jefferson College, and it's basically about how humans for thousands of years have been storytellers, and that story serves a critical function in not just entertaining us, but also establishing morals and ethics and providing people with an escape and It's basically how a lot of us kind of relate to the world around us. And it's not just books and written stories. He talks about movies, he talks about video games. You'll be happy to know, Berthold, that he sees multiplayer role-playing games as the future of story. His last chapter is the future of story, and he basically talks about how these kind of almost like real life multiplayer video games are the way that we will absorb ourselves into story into the future. More and more people will look at story that way. But there was a quote in here that Gertrude Stein praised herself, along with writers like Joyce and Marcel Proust, for writing fiction in which nothing much happens. For our purposes, events have no importance. Nothing much happens, and aside from English professors, no one much wants to read them. And I put a note next to that and say, MFA.
Right.
So, but anyway, this was a fascinating book to me because, you know, we've talked, and I think I wrote a post about does fiction have to have a point? And I think there's different ways to look at that. Does each story have to have a point or a theme or a reason that, you know, a message that the writer is trying to deliver to the readers? And I still will always fundamentally disagree with that. But what this book got me thinking is, okay, so there's not necessarily that kind of a point. There's a different kind of point, though. We want to entertain our readers. We want to provide them with an escape from the real world. It's like last year around this time, I was going to start working as a concessionaire at the local minor league baseball team, and then everything fell apart. But at one point, we did an orientation, and the general manager told all of us that, you know, they do these surveys and customers and fans. Why do you want to come to games? And the number one reason, head and shoulders above everything else, is it's an escape. For 3 hours or however long the baseball game is, that they get to escape their reality and just hang out, watch the game, talk to friends, have a beer, whatever. And that's the same thing with fiction, with storytelling. There's all sorts of functions that it serves. And the biggest one is, and this is why I like to read, while I'm reading the book, and I'm not thinking about problems at work or problems at home or problems here or problems there. I'm not thinking about who our president is. I'm just reading, and I'm in that moment, in that world, and not out here. So anyway.
Yeah, that's true. So we have to create a world that people want to spend time in, which makes me wonder why so much like the gritty, realistic kind of fiction, where somebody has a really tough life and they're struggling and things just get worse before they get better. I don't know, maybe that works because some people can relate, and B, maybe the fictional character's situation is worse than theirs. But I don't know why you'd want to escape into a situation like that.
Well, and he actually addresses that, because he says, well, so yeah, if this is where we want to escape, shouldn't every story be happy and, you know, full of puppy dogs and rainbows? And but no, I mean, fiction revolves around problems and people dealing with problems, and, you know, but it's hard to reconcile the escapist theory of fiction with the deep patterns we find in the art of storytelling. If the escapist theory were true, we'd expect stories to be mainly about pleasurable wish fulfillment. In story worlds, everything would go right and good people would never suffer. But that's not what fiction does. And again, that goes back to, it's not just an escape. It's about people, you know, going through problems and then, you know, getting out of them. It's the good versus evil. And he talks a lot about child play and how children play, and the way children play is every make-believe game they play involves good and bad, and fear of death or fear of this or fear of that, and how you escape that. And that's basically what most storytelling is too. So
yeah,
that sounds like a fascinating book.
Yeah.
it- and I wonder if a lot of the stuff about like fiction having a point, I think that almost it relates to the story structure thing in a way, because I think it comes about when people try to reverse engineer a story. Is like you say, okay, how did the author come up with this? And this, Mark, you use the example of Tolkien in your post, and how some people will say, oh, Tolkien was really writing about World War II or something like
Yeah.
that.
The evil of fascism.
And it's interesting. I mean, I can see a critic looking at it and saying, well, this was going on at the time. It must have been on there, and drawing these parallels between, you know, what the villains are doing in Lord of the Rings and that. Um, but again, it's something I don't think Tolkien would have had that in mind when he was writing it, or at least he wasn't probably consciously thinking of it.
Yeah.
He was just telling a story. And it's the same thing with the 3-act structure, is that nobody consciously says, okay, this is exactly how I'm doing it. But it might be that when you look at a story, you start to, when, like you said, Audrey, when you see a completed story, you can figure out this pattern. It's something that interests me a lot, because, as you know, I like to write about books and try to pick up on themes and things like that. If and I do always ask myself, how much of this is just me reading in stuff that isn't really there? I'm always curious about that. How much of this is the
Well,
author's
yeah, but I think that's part of the deal, is that when someone reads your book or story, they kind of make it their own, and they might get ideas from it that you never intended them to, or that you never thought of. But that's the way it is. I think that's the way it should be. And in fact, if something you read makes you think, sort of find a theme in the book that you think is some sort of basic principle of life or whatever, then that's great, whether the author intended it or not. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that.
There's a quote in this book for everything we've talked about in all of our conversations. To address your point, so did, and we've talked about and we've written posts about how much description is good and bad and all that stuff. So basically, he's talking about this very point, and how fiction brings us into the world and whatever. And he's basically, he ends it with, so it is with any story. A writer lays down words, but they are inert. They need a catalyst to come to life. The catalyst is the reader's imagination. And he uses that. He gives this example of in War and Peace, when young Petya is killed in battle, Captain Denisov is very sad. But how do I know? Tolstoy never tells me that. He never shows me Denisov's tears. All I see is Denisov walking slowly away from Petya's warm corpse. Denisov puts his hand on a fence. He grips the rails. And that's, again, getting back to what you were saying, Bertold. So much depends on the reader's imagination, and letting the reader use their imagination and seeing things that you may not have, as the writer, ever intended to be. So anyway.
That's such a great point, because I've often thought that that's one thing that's interesting about books as opposed to like movies or something. And maybe it's sort of true for movies, but less so, because we could all three read the same book, but we don't see it all the same way when we're reading it and imagining it. So it's really, it's almost like it's not quite the same book for all of us, because we all interpret it differently. And that's something that I think is just fascinating about books.
Yeah. Well, and I remember, I don't remember what story of it was that I wrote, but I wrote a story, and somebody who knew me read it at some point and says, wow, that was you. I could see you in that story. It's like, wait a minute, that story, of all my stories, that's less me than probably anything else. So I don't know what you saw. So anyway.
by the way, Berthold, I just noticed you're wearing a Vespasian moon shirt, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
I thought, well, I'll do advertising, I guess.
That's cool.
Here.
Yeah, I should do something like that too. Walk around with "She Who Comes Forth" written on my
Right.
chest.
Yeah, every once in a while it starts a conversation.
That's very cool.
Thank you.
May get a shirt with all of my book covers on the back or something like that.
Yeah.
What else did we have on our list?
Well,
Or
actually,
what else does anybody want to talk about?
one thing we'd mentioned was coming up with titles. And I mean, this is a good jumping off point for that because this is my favorite of all the titles I've come up with. I struggle a lot with coming up with titles for things.
Yeah, I think I did too. I had a heck of a time coming up with some of them, and others just seemed natural. But I do remember working away and writing down different kinds of titles for most of my books before I settled on the ones I did. So yeah. Now, I'm not sure I want to go through all the duds that didn't make it, but yeah.
Somebody on Twitter asked, and I see this probably pretty regularly, how do you come up with titles? And it's one of those things where I have absolutely no idea how I come up with my titles.
Well, has any of you been working on something and you have a title for it, but it's kind of different from the one you ended up with? Although I guess at first you don't necessarily have to have a title because it's just your Word document. You call it something though, don't you?
Yeah, sometimes I don't have a title immediately, but I pretty frequently come up with the title pretty early on. So that's the name of the Word document. But I there was a writer who told me that One Night in Bridgeport made it sound like a travelogue, and then Weed Therapy made it sound like it was a gardening book. And so I get that kind of criticism, but I seriously have no idea what the recipe is for how I come up with titles.
Yeah, neither do I, really. I just kind of think of different things and suddenly one feels right. That's it. But why it feels right and the others felt wrong, I don't know.
Yeah.
With the directorate until very, very, very late, the Word document was called SFN for Science Fiction Novel because I had no idea what to call this thing.
A lot of times, like I'll give you The Jump. It was The Jump because originally it was just going to be a short story with the first chapter, and The Jump is the key thing in that first chapter. But now that I've continued writing it, I still think I'm going to keep it as The Jump because it just that first chapter and that concept of what the jump is sets the stage for just how upside down the world has become.
Anyway, that's a good title. It's short.
Yeah.
It's kind of evocative of something, it makes you wonder, oh, jump, what jump?
Yeah.
Some jumping up or down or, what is it? So yeah, that's a good one.
That's a great one. I like The Irreparable Past too, although I know it's given you some problems, Mark, because people are like, but it's misspelled. But it's a good title, I think.
I don't even know how I came up with that anymore, to be honest. I don't know, because the story was prompted by this image of somebody sitting on their porch by the bay watching an egret or a heron feed in the shallows, and then I came up with the idea for the story. I have no memory of how I came up with that as the title.
Isn't it the main character who comes up with using that word though?
No.
And applying it to his past or something?
No, and I came up with the title. So in the last chapter, there is a scene where Henry and Maddie are talking, and he's going through the litany of horrors of his life, and she says something about, so you think your life is irreparable, and she says, I always hated irreparable. It doesn't sound right. So that's how I explained the title. But I had the title long before I wrote that chapter. And like I said, I have absolutely no idea how I came up with that title. It just showed up one day.
Yeah, well, that's just it.
Yeah. Those are the things when you've got something, I think, because it's like it'll just come out of the blue and you're like, this is perfect.
Well, but again, as you said, having a misspelled word in the title was probably not the smartest thing to do, but that's part of self-publishing, is you get to do what you want. And if it affected my sales or whatever, that's fine. But once I had that title, I knew that was what the title was going to be.
Right.
I toyed with a lot of different titles for weed therapy, maybe half a dozen others, because one of the concerns about that is people will say, oh, that must be a story about marijuana. No, it's not a story about marijuana or gardening. Well, sort of.
That's okay. That's what I thought when I first saw it. I was like, oh, this is probably about marijuana.
Yeah, no, I know.
That's the one you unpublished, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I wish I could publish it. It has that's the one story I wrote with a point. So.
Right. Yeah, I think coming back to points of stories, I think if you want to, I don't know, pitch some sort of idea by way of your fiction, I think that's really hard to do well. I think that would be off-putting in many. Like that one you mentioned, a thriller that was clearly had some sort of Christian message that sort of swamped the story at times. I think that's a mistake. I think it's better if you you may have something in the back of your mind, but it stays in the back of your mind, and maybe it influences the writing, and maybe some readers will find it and others won't. But as long as the story is otherwise good, that really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But I think that's the best way to keep it, rather than turn. Otherwise, you might as well just forget about writing a novel and write something else.
Write an essay on what your message is.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say to that is there are some authors and I hold up George Orwell always as my example of this, but I'm sure there are others. They have something they want to say, but they feel that for whatever reason they can't just outright say it. So they use an allegory or a fable or something like that so they can say it without really saying it. And I think he's an example of someone who did that fairly successfully. But obviously, I mean, it's tough. It's like, well, if you're George Orwell, sure, you can do it. But you're right, Audrey. It's very, very difficult to do in a way that still is telling a good story.
Yeah. I can't say I've ever tried that myself. So, although, I think there's themes in some of my books, but that's not really the important thing. Like I say, if people read one of them and have no idea about the theme, well, that's fine, as long if they enjoyed the story. I'd rather have them say that was a good book, I enjoyed it, it was an escape, like we were saying earlier, rather than, I struggled through it because I felt the theme was important. So.
Can I play book critic mode for a second? And I'll just say that I do think there is a theme in at least in Friendship of Mortals, of the Herbert West is a completely amoral, total logic reasoning machine versus Milburn's sort of idealistic romantic nature. I think there is sort of a theme there which I enjoyed a lot. That was great. And is that in the Lovecraft? I guess Lovecraft's story is it's barely more than a sketch.
Yeah, that's true. And he wasn't really into characters anyway. Like the character was just someone who experienced. But to tell you the truth, I think Herbert West is maybe one of his more memorable actual characters, as opposed to most of his other stories, the cosmic horror ones. You don't really remember the characters. In fact, they're just kind of like the reader sort of takes the place of that character, and you experience all this weird stuff, and that's the whole point of it. You don't kind of think about think of the guy in the Shadow over Innsmouth, this fellow who goes on this genealogically based trip to this crumbly old town, and all kinds of weird things happen to him. You don't really think about him that much as a character. It's more like you're right there, trying to get away from these people who look sort of like they're turning into fish, and they're all out to get you, and you have to actually, that had quite a bit of action in it, where the guy used the curtains in his room to swing out of the window and jump onto a roof on the neighboring building, and it's quite thrilling in that way. But you don't really get a good sense of what this guy is like as a person. But yeah, no, my underlying theme in Friendship with Mortals was alchemy. And the thing that was being alchemized was Herbert West, right?
Right.
Was being turned from the totally amoral guy into a better guy by being subjected to, processes that, well, I just, I don't want to cause a spoiler for myself here.
Yeah, I realized a few minutes ago I just completely ruined the ending of The Irreparable Past.
Not too explicitly.
I can edit that out if you want.
It's okay.
But anyway, so yeah, I mean, that's the underlying theme, but I'm pretty sure most readers, well, I mean, I even mention alchemy. Like, Charles gets interested in alchemy and reads up on it, and even thinks of the last scenes of the book in that sense. But if somebody kind of blows that off and doesn't really care about it, as long as they're sort of interested in what happens, that's really, I'm happy with that. So you have to kind of look at it on different levels, I guess.
Yeah. I think like there's a basic story level where like a book has to tell a good story. Then if you want to go beyond that level, you can have higher themes and stuff, and that's fine, and it can be a lot of fun. But first and foremost, it has to work on the story level.
Yeah, if it's called fiction, yeah, it has to have a good story and reasonable. But even, like I said, even the characters, if the story is really captivating, you can just have kind of a cipher as the character and still be interested in finding out what happens to the cipher who you've sort of identified with by the end. So it's that whole plot driven versus character driven thing that you hear about too. And it's kind of a continuum, I guess, depending.
Here's a quote from this book again that I kind of liked. Fiction, like cocaine, is a drug. People may invent high-minded aesthetic or evolutionary justifications for their fiction habits, but story is just a drug we use to escape from the boredom and brutality of real life.
Yeah. That feeling when you finished reading a book, that is, and you're kind of bookless, and you feel sort of edgy and like, I need a book. Yep. So there's and it's like that, isn't it?
Well, and it's going back to, well, if it's just an escape, every story should be happy and filled with unicorns and whatever else it was I said before. But the absolute best stories I've read are the ones that just leave me feeling worn out and exhausted at the end, and feeling like I just felt so much whatever during the course of reading. And to me, the only way you get there is by going through a lot of trouble and problems and hell and whatever to get to the positive outcome. You can't do that unless you go through a lot of crap.
Mm-hmm. That is true.